Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Midwest Drought Early Warning System webinar on developing an impacts-based framework for drought mitigation in Ohio. My name is Molly Wolozin, and I am a Regional Drought Information Coordinator with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. Next slide. First, just a few housekeeping items. On this webinar, everyone is muted and the webinar is being recorded. A summary of the webinar as well as a link to the recording will be sent out to all registered participants and posted on the U.S. Drought portal or drought.gov. For questions, please use the question box, which is located within the GoToWebinar control panel. You're welcome to enter questions at any time throughout the webinar, and we will answer all of those questions after the presentation. Next slide. Before we get started on the presentation, I wanted to provide a brief overview of NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System. NIDIS was created by Congress in 2006 with a mandate to help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS does this through a series of activities, including the development of regional drought early warning systems, or DEWS, shown on the map here, and through support to improve drought predictions and forecasting, effective drought planning and preparedness, and assessing the impacts of drought. NIDIS also hosts the U.S. Drought portal at drought.gov, which contains a wealth of information on drought research and conditions. Next slide. In the federal drought landscape, NIDIS plays a unique role in the following ways: through convening and coordination, delivering of information, and advancing and integrating research into action. All of NIDIS's work is done in collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. Today's webinar is featuring a presentation from Dr. Aaron Wilson and Dr. Steven Quiring. Dr. Aaron Wilson is the State Climatologist of Ohio and an assistant professor and ag, weather, and climate field specialist with Ohio State University. His duties with OSU Extension allow him to connect his love of weather and climate with the agricultural community throughout Ohio to provide data when needed and increase the understanding of how changing climate is impacting farmers across the state. Dr. Steven Quiring is a professor in the Atmospheric Sciences program in the Department of Geography at Ohio State University as well. He is a climatologist with research interests in hydroclimatology, synoptic climatology, and applying climate data to solve societally relevant problems. After Aaron and Steven's presentation, we'll have time for questions. So again, please use the questions box located in the GoToWebinar control panel to enter your questions at any time throughout the webinar, and we will get to those at the end. So Steven, it looks like you are sharing successfully here. And Aaron, I will turn it over to you, or whoever is going first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Molly. And certainly just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and Molly, to you for allowing us to come and present, some outcomes and results of a project that thanks to you, Midwest DEWS and NIDIS, for funding this project to basically develop an objective impacts-based framework for drought mitigation in Ohio. So Steven, or Dr. Quiring, is the PI on the project, and I've been able to work along with him. This project was closely, basically, a close partnership as well with the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, which is in charge of really drought activities in the state officially. First with Brad Schwartz there, who retired a couple of years ago, and then with Colin Campbell, who more recently moved to a new role. So obviously with any project with shifting and changing roles here a little bit, most of it, we encounter those projects quite often, but that certainly has been the case here. And then several research assistants and even former postdocs and things. So Jackie Beck, Abby Goldberg, Alyssa Reynolds, Ben Salapak. I think you'll see Zach Leeser, who's the state climatologist in Missouri, his name come up today as well. So really a big effort here, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity for this work sponsored by NIDIS. So next slide. Yeah, so Stephen and I thinking about how to address today, and thought it would be best to just kind of start off with kind of a drought overview of Ohio here. And obviously, there are a lot of ways to define drought. There are a lot of different indices, indicators to use, and I think one of the better ones to kind of look at the broad picture of drought in Ohio is using the Palmer Drought Severity Index back to the late 1800s here. And so obviously, wet periods indicated by those green bars at the upward direction, and the yellow bars or gold bars pointing downward here, so showing drier conditions throughout time. So historically, Ohio has experienced periods of low precipitation that last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, especially in that period 1930 to 1966. And Dr. Rogers, the former state climatologist, did a lot of work with climatological aspects of drought in Ohio. So if you look in the center part of that time series there, you'll see some pretty low PDSI values there. So the lowest in Ohio's record here, this minus 7.28 in March of 1931, just indicating kind of the low point dry, at least according to this indicator. And of course, we all know drought monitoring, prediction, detection has changed over time, and we've certainly added a lot of new indicators and things. So thinking about how that's changed, but what's really nice about this photo is that it's clear, or figure, it's clear to see that really over the last 40 years, droughts have been comparatively shorter in length, and perhaps lesser in magnitude, although we can think about, again, if you think about the number of different ways of measuring the magnitude of drought, certainly with this one, it indicates, right, that these are relatively shorter in length, lesser magnitude than, say, that period between 1930 and 66. So this is sort of, kind of the broad overview of drought throughout time. And obviously, we've had a lot of effort recently in terms of improving what that looks like. So we're all familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor, or perhaps if you're not, the Drought Monitor, really its inception began late 1999, 2000. Collection, really, you have the national authors, you've got a lot of local experts within the state, and a huge listserv of users that are providing inputs and local impacts to help guide that process. And certainly over this time, if you look back, we've had several periods of abnormally dry to moderate drought conditions in Ohio, but we've only reached D3 on rare occasions here in Ohio. So if you click the next slide, or then click here probably twice, we'll come back to those. This is kind of looking at that 2007 period here in Ohio, where we reached a pretty significant period of D3 drought. And Ohio's never been classified as a D4 or exceptional drought. Mostly abnormally dry to moderate drought conditions, and occasional severe drought, very rarely D3 and no D4. So some of the motivating questions for us, about how accurate is this, thinking about questions like, have we underestimated impacts of drought in Ohio? How well is our impact gathering sort of mechanism in the state to get the most up-to-date and local information that can help feed into the system? So that's one of the background motivating factors. Steven will show you a plot later that kind of we've honed in a few of these case studies throughout the USDM period here to help guide some of the research questions. Next slide. So drought declaration process in Ohio, similar in other states, but also different. Obviously, they vary quite greatly across the United States in terms of who kind of dictates the process. Any drought alerts, drought declaration, burn bans, statewide voluntary use restrictions, those are all obviously mandated or proclaimed, declared through the governor's office. But as I mentioned before, the Ohio EMA is really the assigned state agency that is in charge of the process, from activating our impact task groups, the actions, kind of leading the actions of the drought assessment committee that gather with certain triggers right now nominally written into our annex based on the USDM levels, but that's also sort of been a process of evaluation, analysis, and change throughout this project as well. But they're really kind of in charge of regular reports to the committee, to the governor's office, thinking about the status of local governments concerning drought and keeping them informed of the situations. So Ohio EMA is really at the heart of our process here in the state. Next slide. But we have a lot of partners. Obviously, this, when you think about addressing or assessing drought across the state, we've got a lot of partners, again, federal and also statewide. National Weather Service, obviously, USGS, Department of Natural Resources, Agriculture, USDA Farm Agency, the State Climate Office. We're involved in providing updates, more so of late OSU Extension through my role of getting local agriculture-based observations as well into the process. EPA, it goes on, and a lot of partners that obviously come to the table about this. But our talk today isn't really about what the process is or our drought annex in and of itself, but it's all contextual for this is really what we're hoping to advise or improve the overall process through these objective-based impacts. So the goal of the project, again, provide timely and accurate drought information and tools to support science-driven decision-making. We want to enhance that adaptive capacity for Ohio EMA in these droughts. So we have our State of Ohio Emergency Operations Plan led by the state planner, the Drought Incident Response Annex. But we want to focus, what are some of the tools that we can create to develop to help the agency when declaring drought? And can we do this, how objectively can we do this? And then also about these impacts. So if we look at the next slide, we can break this larger project goal down into a series of our objectives here. So let's evaluate the existing drought monitoring tools that we lean heavily on here in Ohio for agricultural drought, hydrological drought, ecological drought, et cetera, and think about how to identify which are most appropriate for Ohio EMA's use here. Deploy an operational drought monitoring system based on the results of this objective 1. And again, about assessing the impacts of past drought events in Ohio and quantify how these impacts vary by drought type. Is there an idea that we can improve upon our drought impacts table that you'll find with the US Drought Monitor? And then again, kind of the fourth objective here, these objective impacts based thresholds. So it's all about, improving existing decision-making process, again, officially sanctioned by the State of Ohio's Emergency Operations Plan and the Drought Incident Annex. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Quiring to talk about more of the results.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks, Molly, for the opportunity to give this presentation today. We gratefully acknowledge the funding provided by NIDIS to support this project, and it's been a great opportunity to focus on improving the characterization of drought within Ohio and to systematically collect and evaluate drought impacts within our state. And we think that this is relevant, certainly to the state of Ohio, but more broadly to the Midwest region, and potentially some of the methods and approaches could also be applied in states that are in more diverse climate regions across the United States as well. So as Aaron mentioned, there are 4 objectives, and I'm going to spend some time walking through the results of those objectives. And objective 1 really is focused on identifying which drought indices work best within the Ohio context. There are literally hundreds of different indices and indicators that are used, and dozens of them are routinely evaluated by the US Drought Monitor authors. And so we wanted to look specifically for Ohio to see which ones tend to work best and what are the timescales that work best. And so this required us to pull together a diverse set of data. And some of this information we've re-aggregated at different spatial scales. And so because we're focused on agricultural drought, hydrologic drought, and ecological drought, we've started with gridded data sets that are at 4-kilometer resolution. So this includes the PRISM data set. And then we have, depending on the type of drought that we're looking at, aggregated those data to either counties when we're thinking about the agricultural drought comparison, since our drought impacts data for that is available at the county level, or watersheds. And here specifically, we're thinking about the HUC 8 designation for watersheds. And there are a number of those across the state that we looked at for this assessment, 65 in total. And then we also are coupling that with impacts data. And so the impacts data in this case for agricultural drought, we focused on yields. And for hydrologic drought, we focused on stream flow. And so we have yield data for all counties within the state of Ohio, and we have hydrologic data for the 65 watersheds that are shown in the map below. There are some other watersheds where there are gauges, but there was an inadequate period of record or too much missing data. And so these are the ones that are relatively complete, less than a year of missing data during the period of record for this analysis. I'd also like to note that there's a lot of details that we won't have time to cover today. And so some of this analysis was undertaken by other members of my research group, former members of my research group. The lead author of this paper is Ning Zhang, and another former PhD student of mine, Jiying Li, are the two first authors on this paper that was published last year on our impacts-based thresholds approach. So to start with, we'll walk through this by breaking it down into looking at hydrologic drought, agricultural drought, and then ecological drought. And the ecological drought in some ways is the most interesting because there's been the least amount of work done in the literature, but it's also the most complicated, and it's the one that we're still working on developing the paper for. So Jackie Beck, one of my current PhD students, is on the webinar today, and she is continuing to work on this analysis. So we certainly welcome questions, suggestions, and input as we get to the ecological drought part. And if you have expertise or have looked at the data on that already, please reach out to Aaron or myself or to Jackie, because we're have expertise on the drought and climate side, but we would not consider ourselves to be wildlife ecologists. So some of the interpretations may not be quite as refined as we might like. So as I mentioned, for hydrologic drought, the polygons that are shown here on the map for Ohio are the 65 watersheds, and this includes ones that are considered natural as well as ones that have anthropogenic modification. And we looked at a comprehensive set of watersheds, even those with dams or diversions or reservoirs on them, because we wanted to cover as much of the state of Ohio as possible. And we also evaluated the watersheds and found that even in those with significant human activity, the correlation between the drought indices and the stream flow remains relatively high, a median correlation of 0.8 across the state. So this shows the spatial variation for the standardized precipitation index, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, and Palmer's Z index. All of these have been calculated at, for this slide here, a 9-month time scale, and then stream flow has been converted into units of millimeters over that period to kind of standardize things. And so we can see some spatial patterns in the changes of the strength of the correlations, and we can see some patterns in terms of certain indices having stronger correlations than others. So in this 3-panel comparison, the Palmer's Z index tends to have correlations that are a little bit higher than the standardized precipitation index or evapotranspiration index. And we see that things in the western part of the state of Ohio tend to have higher correlations between drought indices and the stream flow than in the east. We can also, that was looking at things in units of millimeters. We can also standardize stream flow in all of these watersheds by converting it to stream flow percentiles. And this is also what we use in our paper to look at the impacts-based drought thresholds. And so here you can see that this really increases the correlation, the strength of the relationship between the drought indices and the stream flow when we standardize it to look at what is normal in that watershed for that time of year based on the entire period of record. And there's really just one outlier here where we see that things are strongly influenced by the reservoir on this watershed and the fact that stream flow is highly regulated and controlled at that location. So we did a similar analysis, but obviously the spatial resolution here is different. And so for both corn and soybeans, we took the long-term yield data, we detrended the yield data, and so removed that long-term trend that exists from technological improvements and the evolution of hybrids and all of the other farming innovations that have happened over time. So we removed that linear trend individually for each county, and then we calculate the anomalies from that, and then we look at changes, those departures in yield versus the changes in the drought indices. And so for yield, obviously we have one value per year, so we're looking at correlations between the end of season yield versus the within season drought conditions. And we did this separately for each week and each time period of the year. So if you want to know which week in Ohio is most our crops most sensitive to, you can see that that varies a little bit between the different indices, but the standardized precipitation index around week 29, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index around week 28, and the Z index around week 30. And then we can look at this across all of the counties. So we show it in a map here, what the correlation is between each of the drought indices and the end of season yield. And again, there's a spatial pattern to this. So in Northeast Ohio, there are counties that have higher correlations than in Northwest Ohio, and that the spatial pattern and the gradient varies a little bit from one index to another. But when we average this across the state, we can see that while the SPEI and Z index have slightly higher correlations, they're not statistically significantly different than the median correlation with the standardized precipitation index. So all three of these indices have value, and we can also do this separately for each crop. So obviously they have a different phenology and timing of growth. And so as a result, the peak in when the maximum correlation occurs varies a little bit for soybeans versus corn. A couple of weeks later, typically in the year, is when we observe that strongest. So these are weekly correlations, so just looking at conditions in a single week versus the end of season yield. This is looking at it across the whole season. So if we look at SPI conditions, the standardized precipitation index across the whole year versus the end of year yields. And again, there is a coherent spatial pattern that is evident, at least with the standardized precipitation index and the SPEI, where we have higher correlations in the northwestern part of the state, and that decreases as we move to the south and the east. And there are some agronomic reasons and reasons related to the number of farms and the number of acres grown and other factors that we don't have time to unpack here. But nonetheless, we can determine kind of the optimal time periods and indices based on looking at the impacts data. So we also have replicated this analysis using ecological drought impacts. And this is the part that I think is fairly unique. And this is, if there's tough questions, hopefully Jackie Beck is on the call so she can answer them, but she has pulled data from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources bow hunter surveys, and that provides us with information on the beaver, muskrat, coyote, raccoon, fox, and opossum population counts. We have pulled aquatic species information, so from the Ohio State Biological Museum, their aquatic database. And this goes back into the 1960s, although the most reliable data are from 1993 through 2017. And then also the USGS breeding bird surveys, which extend back to the 1970s And in this case, for our analysis, we focused on the period from 1999 through 2019. So in the following slides, there's a lot of details on how we have to, filter and process and quality control the data. The analysis that we're showing mainly focuses on the 1999 through 2019 period because of those data quality issues. So here we have a table that shows the results for mammals, and the different mammals are listed across the top, from coyote to beaver, and then the drought indices are listed here in rows. These are correlations that are looking at the correlation between the population, the number of individuals that were counted in that survey, versus each of the drought indices aggregated over that time period. And you can look at the different indices, EDDI and the SPI and the Z-index and the SPEI. The darker the color, the stronger the correlation, and the correlations that are listed in bold are statistically significant based on the sample size. So in general, most of this table is colored blue. So that means that there are negative correlations, or that the terrestrial mammal populations tend to increase as conditions get drier. And that if we look at the individual indices, there are stronger correlations with things like the 9-month SPI and than there are with some of the 1-month or some of the shorter time scales, the Z-index, which also has a short time scale. Now the question is, well, why do these relationships exist? So this could be due to increased foraging, the necessity for them to extend their range. And so as conditions get drier, maybe it's more likely for them to be cited in these population surveys because of that. This is speculation, and there's lots of confounding factors, so we need to unpack the why a little bit more. We have also replicated this analysis with fish and birds. So this shows a similar table of correlations between different species, from largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, walleye, and quillback. Again, this is population counts binned by year versus the drought conditions for different drought indices for that year. And again, here you can see that the sign of the relationship is different. We have more of red shading in this table indicating a positive relationship, and so that the fish populations generally tend to decrease when conditions are drier. And this could be related to reduced water quality, reduced water quantity, increased vulnerability to predators or disease, or other issues related to their availability of food for those populations. Third, we have the ecological drought results presented for our bird counts, and these are aggregated to families across the top. We also have done this with species, but there's 117 species that are counted. And so it would be a table that was too large to show within a PowerPoint presentation. Here we see that the row with the most statistically significant correlations is the 9-month SPI, and that these are negative correlations indicating that bird populations tend to increase as drought indices get more negative or conditions get drier. What is not shown within this table is that when we collapse things to the family level, there's a lot of within family variability with individual species. And so these histograms show the correlations for all 117 avian species. And so in this case, the count of how many species fall within each one of these bins, these are correlations. 0 is in the middle, positive to the right and negative to the left. The vertical dashed lines are the statistically significant correlations. And so, for example, there are 44% of the species fall within statistically significant bins. The correlations range from negative 0.55 to positive 0.52, with the mean value being around -0.3. And so This varies a lot by individual species, and so there's a lot more work and a lot more things that we could talk about within the scope of this. But and Jackie's continuing to work on it, and it's very interesting. So to summarize, for agricultural drought, we see a 3-month time scale working the best. That's where the strongest correlations are. And the SPI, SPEI, and Z-index worked well for quantifying agricultural drought conditions in terms of corn and soybeans within the state of Ohio. For hydrologic droughts in Ohio, as represented by stream flow, the 9-month SPI, SPEI, and eddy data worked well for characterizing deviations in stream flow. For ecological drought, the 6 to 9 month time scale, and a lot of the results I showed today sort of focus more on that 9-month time scale, especially for the SPI and SPEI. There are a lot of statistically significant correlations when we use the evapotranspiration deficit index as well, but those sometimes contradict what we see with the SPI and SPEI, meaning they have a different sign. And so that's why I've kind of separated them here. There's a little more we have to do to explain why that would make sense. All right, so based on objective 1, that allowed us to move forward with objective 2, which is developing this drought monitoring system that is specifically focused on Ohio. And so here, the work of Alyssa Reynolds and then Abby Goldberg was very helpful in pulling in existing data sets, but focused on displaying them all in a single location and displaying them in a way that matches what the results of our objective 1 showed, so that we can kind of group things and say, here's the recommended indices for agricultural drought. Here's the recommended indices for ecological drought. Here's the recommended indices for hydrologic drought. And so that while there are dozens of indices that are available, it gives some guidance as to which are the ones that provide the most useful information as indicated by our impacts-based assessment. And so this tool is something that is living and active and available, and that we continue to refine and hope to continue to develop and support with ongoing funding provided through our state partners. With the third objective, and these are some drought events of record that Aaron highlighted earlier in the talk. Here the goal was to assess the impacts of these past drought events in Ohio and to quantify how these impacts vary depending on the type of drought, the severity of drought, and the focus of impact. And so these are ones that, for example, the 2007-2008 drought is the most intense during the U.S. Drought Monitor period of record, that 2000 to present roughly. And then some other significant events that have occurred in recent memory that the team also focused on. And so we have done case studies for each of these drought events, and some of those case studies are included in the paper that I referenced earlier. And we also have some additional information from the ecological drought analysis. So this is what it looks like if we think about ecological drought impacts for those 4 case study droughts that were shown on the previous slide. And here, we're not reporting correlations, we're reporting changes in population. And so these are percentage changes where the green represents an increase in species abundance, and red indicate a decrease in the population of that species during the drought event as compared to the preceding years. And what you'll note is that if we look at the most recent significant drought, the 2016 event, and we look at terrestrial mammals, we can see that for all the mammals that were tracked within the state of Ohio, we're showing increases in the population of those of those mammals, and that agrees somewhat with what we see for the 2002-2003 event, where there are some increases or values that are kind of near zero, but is different from how the 2007 and 2012-2013 drought influenced the mammal populations. Similarly, if we look at the bird population, the numbers here are maybe less pronounced, but in general, with the 2016 drought event, we saw decreases in bird counts through many of the different major families, and that matched what occurred during the 2002-2003 event. But again, these other two events in the intervening time period saw things more increases than decreases in those. And so what this indicates is that there is both variation in drought impacts depending on how you characterize the event, depending on the magnitude, location, and severity, and that there are also obviously other confounding factors that can influence this. So longer term changes in non-climatic factors, whether it's disease, whether it's predators, whether it's the availability of food sources, could also complicate the picture here when we're just looking at species abundance. And we've done this also with the crop yields and with so agricultural drought and hydrologic drought, and summarize that. We'll come back to that at the end because I think that's a nice place to sort of wrap up the project as we think about what are the specific drought impacts that are associated with each type of drought and with the different levels of drought severity. All right, so the fourth objective of the project was to say, okay, now we know which indices are most important for monitoring drought for different types of drought within the state of Ohio. We know the timescales that are important for that, and we've looked at what the impacts are. We've spent time and effort developing ground truth, real impacts, and all of those impact categories have challenges, as I mentioned, and caveats and issues with using them. Nonetheless, they're our best method of systematically and objectively representing what has occurred as a result of past droughts within the state of Ohio. So given that, we want to evaluate the suitability of the fixed drought thresholds. And here, when I say fixed drought thresholds, what I'm referring to is what is shown in this slide right here on the right-hand side. These are the US drought monitor categories from D1 to D4, so from moderate to exceptional drought, and then various indices that are commonly used, including the Standardized Precipitation Index and the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and then showing the thresholds that are associated with this. And these thresholds are called fixed because they are consistently applied across all states and across all seasons. And so the question becomes, are they appropriate for every climatic region and for every season? And the reason why we think they might not be the best for looking at drought within the state of Ohio is based on past work. And Aaron referenced Zach Leeser, a former PhD student and postdoc of mine who is now the Missouri State Climatologist. And so his graduate research focused on looking at how suitable are things like the SPI fixed thresholds in places where we have strong precipitation gradients. So this shows across the southern US, if the SPI fixed thresholds were well suited for monitoring D4 drought conditions in this region, everything would be colored in the shade of white or a light color, and the darker colors indicate departures or proportional differences in the frequency of D4 as compared to what we would theoretically expect based on this, so the fact that a D4 drought should occur, it's associated with the 0 to 2nd percentile. And so we can calculate what the expected occurrence or frequency is if we have a really long time period. And then we can look at how often the SPI value actually reaches that. And we can see that within the state of Texas, just based on where you are, influences the likelihood of seeing D4. And so in the eastern part of Texas, it occurs more frequently than expected, and in the west, it occurs much less frequently than expected. And this is a function of how the index is calculated, and also has an influence on what the best thresholds are. And we've also done this on a global basis, and so this paper isn't out yet, but it's under review. And again, if it worked well everywhere in the world, we would see these gray colors. And so places where it's blue or red indicate that those fixed thresholds are not performing well for indicating drought severity. So with that said, we want to use objective thresholds, and it's too complicated to fully explain the methodology for doing this, but that's contained within Zach's paper that I showed on the previous slide. And so here we're using the impacts and saying, okay, if exceptional drought is the 2nd percentile, let's use the streamflow percentiles and the yield percentiles to determine what that is, and then determine what the SPI value is that's associated with when we have streamflow in that category. So here's an example of what that looks like, where we have a histogram, and that histogram looks at yield departures, and we calculate where the top 2% and then the next categories are. So looking at this, where we say, okay, 0 to 2%, the 3rd to the 5th percentile for D3, the 6th to the 10th percentile for D2, and we use those percentiles on corn and soybean yields, and then we can calculate what the threshold should be. So here's what that looks like. Across in the top row, we have corn yields in the state of Ohio versus the SPI, SPEI, and Z index. And then we've divided these. So the dots are now color coded based on yield per percentiles into the red, D4, D3, D2, D1, D0. And so we can then use that to say, well, what is the threshold where we start to see D4-like yields based on the Z index, and then we can apply that. So if we do that, this is the result that we get, where typically we see for the standardized precipitation index, a D1 drought begins when the SPI has a value of less than -0.8. And that category goes from -0.8 to -1.2. If we calculate that based on yields in Ohio, we can see that D1 drought impacts for corn yields actually start when we have an SPI value of around -0.5. So all of these gray boxes indicate the corn yield based drought thresholds that correspond to these descriptions provided by the US Drought Monitor. So this indicates that the drought impacts in Ohio begin at thresholds that are less severe than indicated by the fixed thresholds that are commonly used. And we can do this with soybeans. We can do this with the streamflow departures. And so when we do that, that allows us to look back at past droughts. So here we're showing the US Drought Monitor, the percent of the state of Ohio that is in D1 to D3 drought for this 2007 to 2008 time period, the most severe drought that Aaron referred to at the beginning. And then we can apply those thresholds that we showed here in the right-hand column and say that if we're using those SPI-based objective yield thresholds. This is how we would classify the percentage of the state of Ohio in terms of, in this case, D1 to D4 drought, because there's no D4 that shows up in the US Drought Monitor in the 2007. But if we use our yield thresholds, it suggests that there were parts of the state for agricultural drought that may have been experiencing conditions that were that extreme. And we can do this separately for any impact and any drought index that's of interest. And so this allows us to compare what the US Drought Monitor shows in terms of the percentage of the state that's categorized in D1 to D4 drought versus the percentage of the state that would be categorized based on hydrologic drought objectively determined thresholds. So that's what this right-hand column is. So for the 9-month SPI, one of our best indicators of hydrologic drought, if we use objective drought thresholds, we can see that for an event like 2012, it changes the severity and spatial extent of drought conditions. Of course, this is for a single indicator, and it's contextualized for Ohio, where the US Drought Monitor uses a convergence of evidence approach, and it is using lots of indicators. And so it's not only meant to represent hydrologic drought, which is why we see differences between them. So even if this were to be applied, it wouldn't necessarily dramatically change that. Anyways, there's a lot to unpack here. In the interest of time, I will refer you to the papers and also encourage you to ask questions if you have want further clarification on how we did it or why we did it or what it means. Aaron, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to take it and kind of wrap us up here in the last couple slides and in the last couple minutes here. So obviously, you know, a lot about the objective-based thresholds, but of course, you know, we have a process in place where we are really leaning on subjective information as well, and local reports and observations with our eyes and ears and things. And so when you think about these Ohio droughts from the 1890s to 1998, some of the earlier droughts, I think, are best chronicled or at least summarized in a really good book that was written by Schmidlin and his wife, Tom and Jean, in 1996, called Thunder in the Heartland. And so it's pretty interesting read. And when you think about, you know, these observations collecting over time, and I see Brad Schwartz is on the call. And so as a state planner, of course, he was very meticulous about writing summaries and collecting information and news articles and that sort of thing. But what about before Brad? What about in the past? And how can we kind of assess some of those historical impacts to think about, again, a more refined way of declaring drought in Ohio? So some of these in the book are really interesting. You know, you think, obviously, we leaned a lot on newspapers, many of which are not around anymore. Thinking about, you know, in 1895, this in the book, quote, no hay was available for market in June. Some farmers were replanting hay fields with corn to be used for animal feed. Another one from our 53 to 54 drought, you know, looking at Knox County farmers whose wells were empty. They were allowed to haul water from Mount Vernon, a close by city, in their water system. And even as recent as 1988, one of the most peculiar, I think, entries in the drought, you know, a local florist up in Sandusky County paid $1,000 to bring a Sioux medicine man from the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota to begin a 4-day rainmaking ceremony on June 19th. So this is the late 1980s, and just thinking about, you know, the many different ways that we feel and experience drought, but how can we collect those to improve our classification of drought across the way? And these are a couple cool photos from our Historical Society and for the 1930 drought, Fayette County, and then also the 1988 drought in Dart County. So, you know, thinking about a systematic way of collecting and curating the historical impacts. You know, Brad retired, you know, thinking about how do we move forward with that, but even before his time. So, you know, thinking about how do we begin to bring together the impacts in one location. That varied quite a bit, you know, so for those that are involved in drought monitoring and being involved in the USDM, you know, there are a lot of sources of information. You know, this is just a couple of examples of one, you know, monthly water inventory reports from the Division of Water, ODNR, some notes from Brad here, but then, you know, collecting summary reports and how, you know, what we've done is an attempt to kind of amass those, at least in a digital format, to start to get these into one location. And then ultimately on the next slide, you'll see it's about, can we improve, again, another aspect. We've got these historically observed impacts according to the USDM category. The USDM category from D0 to D3, right? And so a good question is, do we wait till lawns go dormant before we have D3? Well, we can argue lawns go dormant much sooner than that. But is there also a way, and you can see on the right, and this was a lot of work, and it's ongoing, right? This is a work in progress, but a lot of work by Abby, looking at, let's look at the drought categories, let's look at these historical impacts and think about agricultural, hydrological, and ecological impacts as well. Can we bring some more refinement, some further details to what's happening, even including things like affecting landscaping businesses, which is, not, as you see as an example of it under ag and D1, or thinking about mosquito populations from an ecological perspective, or can we bring in different aspects or different information besides what we see here on the left-hand side to help us understand and be able to categorize drought in a more effective way. And so we're really working toward improving the drought impacts table for Ohio as a key aspect of this project. So it's difficult. There's a lot of challenges, right? From collecting the information to actually being able to, decipher down and categorize and think about how these impacts really help us define what drought is out there. So we're sort of playing both hands, right? Really focused on objective base, but then also thinking about what is somewhat subjective when we deal with these impacts as we perceive them in different kind of categories and different types of droughts. And so that's what's made, I think, brought some excitement and some neat things, as you saw today in our webinar, to this project. So we really appreciate it. So next slide. Really, again, it's all about providing timely, accurate drought information. Hopefully this is information that, for, those that are in other states that are looking to do this, perhaps, thinking about ways or methods, at least to initially develop of how do we come up with some impacts-based thresholds, right? And think about that across the many areas that experience drought, right? Throughout Ohio and throughout the world. So it's really a state level pilot project is what this was, to inform regional and national best practices. We're hoping, right, we can continue to find support and even refine this even further moving forward. So with that, we'll bring you to the last slide for our time here. Just again, to thank you for your attention. Certainly want to thank Steven for his presentation, and again, thank Molly and thank NIDIS for funding this project and allowing us to take a look at a little deeper dive in drought in Ohio. So with that, I will turn it back over to Molly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for that fantastic presentation. It really provided a lot of information, but I thought in a way that was very easy to understand. So thank you. So we are going to we have a few minutes here for some questions, and we have a couple in the questions box. But again, just please, if you have any, go ahead and type them in and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first question is going back to a correlation slide on wondering why Erie and Ottawa counties are missing from the correlation slide. So Steven, I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, sure. I am scrolling through to find. Oh yeah, I think this is probably a plotting issue as opposed to anything else. We calculated it for every county. It may just have fallen off the plot. So thanks for your sharp eye. I think in the publication it shows up, just not in the slide that I used to present.
Okay, great, thank you. And there was another question of, I'm guessing you want to exclude noise from the swamp or marsh region. And I'm not sure if you all can answer that or if you need some more context.
Yeah, so this probably is just in reference to the the correlation note above. And so in this case, we did not filter any of the data based on land use, land cover, or proximity to water bodies or anything else. So for the county level yield information that was calculated and plotted and applied in every county, for the watersheds, we don't cover every inch of Ohio because we don't have gauges that with complete records in every watershed in Ohio. So for the hydrologic analysis, that's only showing the watersheds for which the period of record was relatively complete.
And if I can chime in there, I mean, it brings up a great question, right? Another kind of method would perhaps looking at the changing landscape, right? And thinking about wetlands and maybe how they've ebb and flow as well based on that, but or ephemeral pools and things like that. So, I mean, there are other aspects or other work that can be done, obviously, to get to some of those questions as well.
Okay, thank you. One question did come in of, is it possible that some of the objective measures work will be able to provide real-time or short-term drought impact for use by counties and the state to respond to drought?
Yeah, so the goal of this work is to enhance real-time drought monitoring and to provide better information at that local or county level, and that these thresholds are absolutely designed to improve things for decision makers at that local scale. And so we're only limited by the impacts data that are available for determining what those thresholds should be, or limited by the spatial resolution of the data itself. But this is not just an academic exercise. It is meant to span the research to operations continuum and to provide guidance to all of the groups that Aaron referred to at the beginning that are involved in monitoring drought conditions within the state of Ohio, and to eventually work their way into the drought annex, where the state sets what those thresholds are that trigger particular mitigation and response activities.
Yeah, and I have to chime in and just commend you all for having such an innovative approach to this. I think you're, as I believe you know, but also just for others, one of the states that's really advancing this idea of trying to identify, indicators that are most appropriate to use. That is something that we hear all of the time. So this is a great example, and I'm glad that we have this to point back to on how other states could potentially do this, or groups as well. Now we just have a couple minutes left. I just have one quick question, and maybe it's not quick, but at the end you were talking about the challenges of getting some of the data, the impact data that you really wanted for this project. I'm curious if you could talk about any of the data that you wanted but you were not able to get, or just, some of an overview of the challenges that you really ran into with trying to find that impact data that could help with your analysis.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were lots of things that we considered, and the reason that we chose yield and that we chose stream flow and that we chose those particular ecological drought indicators is because of the availability of data. But those are certainly not all of the agricultural impacts that we might want to look at, and certainly not all the hydrologic impacts, since things like groundwater levels would also be really helpful. But again, having long-term reliable records for all aspects of the different ways. And in the drought impact table, that kind of shows right? There's a diverse range. There's dozens and dozens of different things that can be influenced by drought conditions, and we get those from local reports. We get those sometimes from the media, but what we don't have for things like, I don't know, mosquito populations is a systematic statewide database that has a high enough spatial resolution to allow us to quantify how those things vary as a function of drought conditions. There might be data collected in a couple locations, but it may not be long enough or at the right spatial and temporal resolution to link it to the drought conditions.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are at time here, and thank you again, Aaron and Steven, for such a great presentation. And just as a reminder, we will provide a summary of this recording along with a link to the webinar recording. We'll send that out by email and also post it on drought.gov. And I do ask our attendees that if you can take a couple of minutes to answer just 2 survey questions to provide some feedback on what you heard today, that would be wonderful. And that concludes our webinar, and thank you again for joining us.